So now that we are familiar with the basic anatomy of the heart, we can discuss blood flow. Blood flows in a single direction through the heart, and we're going to see that two sets of valves help to accomplish this. When the atria contract, they will push blood through the atrioventricular valves, also known as the cuspid valves, into the ventricles. And then when the ventricles contract, the pressure that is created inside the ventricles will close the atrioventricular valves and simultaneously open the semilunar valves, which are situated between the ventricles and the large arteries that serve those ventricles, such as the pulmonary trunk or the aorta. We will see that the valves are going to open in response to the difference in pressure on either side of that valve. So as mentioned previously, the atrioventricular valves, which are also known as the cuspid valves, are situated between the atria and the ventricles. The semilunar valves are found between the ventricles and the great arteries that those ventricles deliver blood to, such as the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. So we see that there are no valves between the atria and the major veins that are delivering blood to those atria. So when the atria contract, most blood is pushed down into the ventricles, and very little is forced back up into the veins that serve them. There are no valves between the atria and the major veins at all, and there's a few physiological reasons for this. The first is that the inertia, that is the movement of the blood flowing from the veins into the atria that they're delivering blood to, actually prevents backflow of blood into those veins. So the inertia, that movement of blood flowing into the atria, prevents any blood from moving the opposite direction when the atria contract. So the second is that when the atria contract, the venous openings in the atria are briefly sealed off. If we examine a diagram here, we can clearly see the lack of valves between the openings of the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava in the right atrium, because the superior and inferior vena cava are delivering blood to the right atrium. And we see a lack of valves between the pulmonary veins, that is the right and left pulmonary veins, and the left atrium. The cuspid valves are named because they are shaped like cusps on teeth. The tricuspid valve, which is located between the right atrium and the right ventricle, has 3 cusps, and the bicuspid valve has 2 cusps and is located between the left atrium and the left ventricle. And you can also refer to them as the right and left atrioventricular valves, but sometimes it's easier to remember the bicuspid and tricuspid valve. The aortic and pulmonary valves are also called the aortic semilunar and the pulmonary semilunar valves because of their crescent moon shape. So let's examine how the atrioventricular valves work. So we see that in this diagram that at number 1, blood is returning to the heart and filling the atria, which is going to press against the atrioventricular valves, that is, the valves that are located between the atria and the ventricles. The weight and pressure of that blood is going to increase, and eventually it will force those atrioventricular valves open. The ventricles will then begin to fill, because the valve flaps are just kind of hanging in the ventricles as a result of the high pressure that was experienced in the atria. Then what will happen is that the atria will contract, which will increase the pressure in the atria and force additional blood into the ventricles. So when the ventricles contract, the atrioventricular valves will prevent backflow of blood back up into the atria. And what's going to happen is that when the ventricles contract, at number 1 there, the blood pressure inside of the ventricles will increase. Some blood will get caught up in the cusps of the atrioventricular valves, and that's going to snap closed those atrioventricular valves. And then what's going to happen is that the papillary muscles are going to contract, and the chordae tendineae will tighten, and that prevents the valve flaps from being blown upward into the atria, and also prevents blood from backflowing up into the atria as well. So let's review here. The tricuspid valve is open when the right atrium pressure is greater than the right ventricle pressure. The same applies for the left side. The bicuspid or the mitral valve is going to be open when the left atrium pressure is greater than the left ventricle pressure. The valves will close when the pressure in the atria is less than the pressure in the ventricles. And the pressure in the atria is going to be lower than the pressure in the ventricles when the ventricles begin contracting, and when the ventricles are contracting. So therefore, the tricuspid valve is closed when the right atrium pressure is less than the right ventricle pressure. And the bicuspid valve is going to close when the left atrium pressure is less than the left ventricle pressure. The semilunar valves operate very similarly, and these valves function to prevent backflow of blood from the large arteries like the pulmonary trunk and the aorta into the ventricles. So let's examine how these valves are opened. So as the ventricles begin to contract, the pressure inside of the ventricles is going to rise and push up against the flaps of the semilunar valves and force them to open. So only the semilunar valves will only open when the pressure in the ventricles is higher than the pressure in the arteries, and the valves will close when the pressure in the large arteries becomes greater than the pressure in the ventricles. So as the ventricles relax and the intraventricular pressure falls, we see that blood is going to flow back from the arteries, fill the cusps of these semilunar valves, and force them to close. And so this will cause those valves to close before really any major volume of blood is able to backflow back into the ventricles. So in summary, the pulmonary semilunar valve is open when the right ventricle pressure is greater than the pressure in the pulmonary trunk. And the aortic semilunar valve is going to be open when the left ventricle pressure is greater than the pressure that's in the aorta. On the other hand, the semilunar valves will close when the pressure in the atria falls below the pressure that's seen in those arteries. So the pulmonary semilunar valve will close when the right ventricle pressure is less than the pulmonary trunk pressure. And the aortic semilunar valve will close when the left ventricle pressure is less than the pressure that is seen in the aorta. So incompetent valves are valves that do not close properly. And incompetent valves allow blood to leak back into the chamber that blood just exited from. So as a result, the heart is going to pump the same volume of blood over and over again due to the backflow of that blood, meaning that the heart has to work much harder unnecessarily. Another condition called valvular stenosis is a condition in which the valves become stiffened due to calcium deposits or scar tissue. This scar tissue or these calcium deposits can be a result of rheumatic fever, so inflammation of the joints, the blood vessels, and the heart also causes inflammation in the valves and can cause scar tissue to accumulate. Endocarditis is another cause of valvular stenosis. Endocarditis is where the endocardium experiences an infection as well as inflammation. With valvular stenosis, the diameter of the valve is constricted when they are open, and the valves do not properly close. So again, here, just like with incompetent valves, the heart must work harder because it is also recirculating or removing the same volume of blood over and over again. Faulty or damaged valves can be replaced with valves from several different sources, including mechanical valves that are man-made from synthetic materials. Humans are also capable of receiving replacement valves from animal sources, such as bovine, which are cow sources, or porcine, which are pig sources. The valves can also be replaced from human cadavers, which means that the valve that is going to be transplanted into the individual that needs it is a natural human heart valve. So recall that the right atrium receives deoxygenated blood from 3 veins: the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus, even though the coronary sinus is only mentioned in this diagram but not shown. As the right atrium fills, the blood puts pressure on the right atrioventricular valve, which is the tricuspid valve, and that's going to open that valve, and blood will begin to flow into the right ventricle. Atrial contraction will help to squeeze a little more blood into that right ventricle. When the right ventricle contracts, the pressure rises in that ventricle, closing the tricuspid valve and opening the pulmonary semilunar valve, which is going to then direct blood to flow into the pulmonary arteries toward the lungs. In the capillaries of the lungs, blood will pick up oxygen and then will be returned to the heart through the pulmonary veins. The left atrium receives oxygenated blood through those pulmonary veins. As the left atrium fills, it will put pressure on the left atrioventricular valve, which is also called the bicuspid valve. That will open that valve and begin to allow blood to flow from the left atrium to the left ventricle. Once again here, atrial contraction of the left atrium is going to help squeeze a little bit more blood into the left ventricle. When the left ventricle contracts, the pressure in the ventricle is going to rise, causing the left atrioventricular valve to close and the aortic semilunar valve to open, which is going to push blood through the aorta to the systemic circuit. And blood in those systemic capillaries will deliver some of its oxygen to the tissues, causing that blood to become slightly deoxygenated. And then that blood will be returned to the heart through the veins. The left ventricle walls are about 3 times thicker than the walls of the right ventricle, and this is because the systemic circuit, which serves most of the body's tissues, is a long and very high friction circuit due to the high number of blood vessels that are located within that circuit. So blood pressure tends to be highest in the systemic circuit, which is why the walls of the left ventricle, shown in this diagram here, are much thicker than those of the right ventricle. The left ventricle must contract more forcefully and generate higher pressures in order to move that blood. So there is a need for more muscle mass and more muscle tissue there to generate those higher forces and those higher pressures.